Hi, my name is Chad Wilkerson, and I'm Vice President, Economist, and Branch Executive of the Kansas City Fed's Oklahoma City office, so I'm Nate's counterpart down here. It's my pleasure to moderate the third session of this year's symposium. This session will explore the ways in which agricultural productivity affects or is affected by businesses and other segments of the agricultural supply chain. As a reminder, the session format will include a speaker, followed by a discussant, and two panelists. There will be time for questions at the end of the session, and you're encouraged to submit questions or comments at any time using the link on the player page. Before we turn to our first speaker, please take a moment to respond to the following question. You're invited to share any additional comments using the questions comments link after responding as well, especially if you select other as your answer. Here's the question. Which industry will see the strongest gains in agricultural productivity growth over the next 10 years? Crops, livestock, fruits, vegetables, and specialty products, aquaculture, or other? Be sure to join for the closing discussion at 12:15 Central this afternoon, as Nate Kaufman will be sharing the results of our session polls at that time. Finally, please note that all the symposium resources, including the following PowerPoint presentation, are available on the Ag Symposium webpage. You can access the website using the link on the player page. And with that, our first speaker for this session is Sergio Lens. Sergio joined the Department of Economics at Iowa State University in 1993, where he is currently professor and Marlin Cole Chair of International Agricultural Economics and serves as Director of Undergraduate Programs. He teaches agricultural economics, financial economics, and leads study abroad courses focusing on the marketing channel for agricultural commodities in different countries. And his research interests span risk management, asset pricing, derivatives, commodity price analysis, and productivity. I'll turn things over to you now, Sergio.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm Sergio Lens, a professor of economics in the department at Iowa State University, and I want to state that the paper I will be presenting today was co-authored by my colleague Alejandro Plastina, who's an associate professor also in the Department of Economics at Iowa State University. Despite the methodological differences in the approaches used to calculate total factor productivity, sometimes also called multi-factor productivity, it has long been recognized as a major engine of growth for agriculture in the United States during the post-war period. Furthermore, the growth of total factor productivity in the farm sector compares very favorably to similar measures of productivity growth in other sectors of the economy of the United States. For example, Jorgensen, Ho, and Samuels found that the farm sector ranked fifth in its contribution to national productivity growth from 1947 to 2010. And it accounted for 7.5% of total United States total factor productivity growth over the same period. This happened even though the ag sector ranked 15th out of 65 industries in its contribution to national value add. Economists have extensively evaluated the effects of knowledge spillovers from other sciences into agriculture, as well as the effects of knowledge spill-ins from agricultural research and development conducted in other jurisdictions on agricultural productivity. However, none have yet analyzed productivity spillovers between the agricultural sector and other economic sectors. This issue is very important because knowing the ways in which agricultural productivity affects and is affected by productivity in other sectors of the economy seems critical in designing better policies aimed at enhancing growth. Given the lack of studies analyzing the relationships between productivity in agriculture and productivity in other sectors, in this study we focus on the productivity linkages between the agricultural sector and 62 other sectors of the economy in the United States. We also measure short and long-run productivity spillovers from and to the agricultural sectors. The other 62 sectors include, for example, fruit production, truck transportation, utilities, retail trade, wholesale trade, chemical products, etc. Before I proceed, it is important that we have the same understanding of what we mean by total factor productivity and the partial productivities of labor and capital, as these are the measures we use to quantify productivity in our studies. First, total factor productivity is the aggregate output of a sector divided by the aggregate inputs used to produce it. For example, in the case of agriculture, we're talking about labor, fertilizer, pesticides, energy, machinery, and the like as inputs. In other words, total factor productivity is the aggregate output per unit of input. Second, the partial productivity of labor is the aggregate output of a sector divided by the aggregate amount of labor employed to produce it. That is, the partial productivity of labor is the aggregate output per unit of labor employed. Third, the partial productivity of capital is the sector's aggregate output divided by the aggregate amount of capital used to produce it. This means that the partial productivity of capital is the aggregate output per unit of capital used. Now, a critical difference between total factor productivity and the partial productivities is that total factor productivity takes into account the effect of substituting one input for another, whereas partial productivities don't. Our main data set is the analytical CLEMS type data used by Jorgensen, Hoare, and Samuels. The acronym CLEMS stands for capital, labor, energy, materials, and services. CLEMS type data are constructed using harmonized definitions and aggregation procedures so that one can obtain industry-level productivity measures that are comparable across countries. As mentioned earlier, we used the CLEMS data on total factor productivity and on the partial productivities of labor and capital for agriculture as well as for 62 other sectors from 1947 through 2014. Why this long period? Well, this long period allows us to apply the proposed time series methods, many of which require a relatively large number of time series observations. As a whole, the CLEMS dataset is the best available data for the purposes of the present study. The CLEMS dataset defines the agricultural sector as the farms industry. To allow for the possibility of stronger spillovers between agriculture and closely related sectors, we classify non-agricultural sectors into ag-related and non-ag-related sectors. Ag-related sectors comprise 10 industries, namely forestry, fishing and related activities, wood products, furniture and related products, food and beverage and tobacco products, textile mills and textile product mills, apparel and leather and allied products, paper products, rail transportation, truck transportation, and food services and drinking places. Non-ag related sectors comprise the 52 other industries excluding farms, federal government, and state and local government. I should note that the most widely used productivity series for agriculture, however, is not CLEMS, but is constructed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The USDA series are available from 1948 to 2017, which overlaps almost entirely with the period for the CLEMS series. Therefore, to verify the robustness of our results, we also analyzed the pairwise association between productivities in agriculture and the 62 non-agricultural sectors using the USDA agricultural series. We investigate productivity spillovers along the agricultural supply chain by analyzing the historical pairwise association between a productivity measure in the agricultural sector and the same productivity measure for each of the other 62 sectors of the U.S. economy. We proceed first by studying the time series properties of the individual series. For example, do they have trends? And in a second step, we test whether the series in each pair tend to move together. Then for each pair of series, we estimate an econometric model to assess causality. For example, whether total factor productivity in agriculture causes total factor productivity in a non-ag sector or vice versa. Finally, we use the fitted model to learn more about the dynamic interactions of the productivity series in each pair, both in the long run as well as the short run. This table shows the results regarding the long-run association between total factor productivity in agriculture and total factor productivity in other sectors. According to the column titled Ag-related sectors of this table, we found that agricultural total factor productivity moves in tandem with total factor productivity in each of the 10 ag-related sectors over the entire period when using the CLEMS agricultural data, and with 9 of the ag-related sectors when using the USDA agricultural data. This result would seem to suggest a strong long-term total factor productivity spillovers between agriculture and ag-related sectors. However, if you look at the column titled non-ag-related sectors of the table, you can see that it also shows that agricultural total factor productivity moves in tandem with total factor productivity with almost all of the non-ag-related sectors of the same period. Together, these findings indicate that agricultural total factor productivity tends to co-move with the total factor productivities of all sectors in the long run, regardless of whether they are related to agriculture or not. In other words, a sector's proximity to agriculture seems to make little difference to its total factor productivity spillovers with agriculture. The next tables I'll be showing you report the results of our investigation into whether a change in ag total factor productivity causes a change in the total factor productivity of other sectors or vice versa, and whether that is the case in the short run or the long run. But before doing so, I need to clarify that I should say the word causality within quotation marks. Because when I say that, for example, ag total factor productivity causes non-ag total factor productivity, I mean that a change in ag total factor productivity in one year is followed at a later year by a change in non-ag total factor productivity. This does not necessarily mean that the ag total factor productivity was a true cause underlying the change in the total factor productivity of the other sector. This is true because to be able to make a true claim of causality, we need to set up an experiment, which is impossible for us to do. That experiment will consist of inducing a productivity shock to agriculture and then measure its impact on other sectors. We only have observational data, and the present analysis is the best we can do with it. This table reports the results of the analysis of whether changes in ag total factor productivity cause changes in the total factor productivity of other sectors. That is, in this table, the direction of causality that we explore is from agriculture to the other sectors. According to the next to last row of this table, a change in ag total factor productivity caused changes in total factor productivity for 40% of the ag-related sectors and for 13.5% of the non-ag-related sectors. Note, however, that most but not all of the total factor productivity changes in the other sector are in the same direction as the original change in ag total factor productivity. Note also that in some cases, the response is short-lived and disappears after 1 year or so, whereas in other cases, the response takes a very long period, say 10 years, to become significant. The results from the table I just showed you can be summarized by stating that shocks to total factor productivity in agriculture are more likely to affect the total factor productivity of ag-related sectors than the total factor productivity of non-ag-related sectors. In addition, long-term productivity responses are more likely than short-term productivity responses in both ag-related and non-ag-related sectors. Finally, productivity responses tend to be, but not always are, of the same sign. This other table shows the main results for the opposite case where we look at the effect of a change in the total factor productivity of a non-ag sector on the total factor productivity of agriculture. That is, in this table, the direction of causality that we investigate is from other sectors into agriculture. In this instance, productivity shocks in just 20% of the ag-related sectors have an impact on agricultural total factor productivity. 20% have the same sign, and 10% have the opposite sign. Most interestingly, all of the impacts from the ag-related sectors are observed over the long run, say 10 years, as there are non-ag-related significant impacts in the short run. The impact of productivity shocks to non-ag-related sectors is even weaker. Total factor productivity in agriculture responds significantly to the total productivity shocks in almost 4% of the non-ag-related sectors in the short run, and in about 13.4% of such sectors in the long run. Further, in most instances, the total factor productivity changes in agriculture induced by a change in the total factor productivity in non-ag-related sector tend to be of the opposite side. In short, regarding the response of total factor productivity in agriculture to a shock in the total factor productivity of another sector, we found that shocks in other sectors' total factor productivity are relatively unlikely to affect agricultural total factor productivity. Also, when the shock in the other sector's total factor productivity affects the ag total factor productivity, the impact tends to occur over the long run rather than the short run. Finally, productivity responses are more likely to be of opposite sign. In this final table, I present a brief summary of the results for the partial productivities of labor and capital. The table shows results corresponding to the two alternative sources of the agri-productivity data, namely the CLEMS and the USDA. In addition, the table shows results not only for the entire 1947-2014 period, but also for the first and second halves of the sample. In the case of the entire period, it is clearly the case that, compared to total factor productivity, the partial productivity of labor in agriculture tends to move less in tandem with the partial productivity of labor in other sectors. In turn, in comparison with the partial productivity of labor, the partial productivity of capital in agriculture tends to move less in tandem with the partial productivity of capital in other sectors. In addition, in contrast to total factor productivity, for which the distinction between ag-related sectors and non-ag-related sectors does not seem to make much of a difference, the partial productivities of labor and capital seem to move more closely for ag and ag-related sectors than for ag and non-ag-related sectors. Another interesting pattern in the table is that comparing the behavior for the entire period versus the first and second halves individually, productivities in ag and other sectors seem to move less in tandem for total factor productivity and the partial productivity of labor, whereas the opposite is true for the partial productivity of capital. What this suggests is that the relationships between productivity in agriculture and non-ag related sectors were relatively stable across both halves of the sample for total factor productivity and the partial productivity of labor, but that seems not to have been the case for the partial productivity of capital. Wrapping up my presentation, I will finalize by saying that our analysis of productivity data for agriculture and 62 other sectors of the economy in the United States over the entire period 1947 through 2014 shows that increases in the total factor productivity of agriculture caused long-lasting increases in the total factor productivity of 15% of 62 other sectors. In contrast, increases in the total factor productivity of agriculture caused long-lasting reductions in the total factor productivity of 5% of the other sectors. On the other hand, shocks in the total factor productivity of 15% other sectors had long-lasting spillover effects into the total factor productivity of agriculture. 3% of the impacts had the same sign, whereas 11% of them had the opposite sign. The partial productivities of labor and capital in agriculture had little association with the partial productivities of labor and capital in non-ag-related sectors. This lack of association was more evident for capital than for labor. Finally, our analysis suggests that relationships between productivity in agriculture and in non-ag-related sectors were relatively stable across both halves of the sample for total factor productivity and the partial productivity of labor, but not for the partial productivity of capital. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sergio, for your remarks. Our discussant for this session is Heidi Schweizer. Heidi is an assistant professor of extension and extension specialist at North Carolina State University. In addition to teaching and research, Heidi is a cooperative extension specialist addressing research topics that intersect both freight and agricultural market needs in North Carolina. She has specific interest in the contributions of the freight transportation system to agricultural marketing and food supply chain resiliency. Thanks for joining us for this session this morning, Heidi, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chad. I just wanted to highlight some of the main takeaways from Sergio and Alejandro's paper and make a couple connections to what's happened this past year. I work in cooperative extension, and so you can think of me a bit as an intermediary between academia and agricultural stakeholders. And many people interested in this topic are in the business and policy world, not just economists. So I just want to briefly address total factor productivity and what it is and why we care. So as Sergio mentioned, it's the aggregate output per unit of input. For example, productivity can vary by firm, and some firms might use certain inputs more efficiently or more intensely, and two firms can have different levels of output despite using the same quantities of inputs. And specifically by using aggregate data like Sergio and Alejandro did, what we have is this 30,000 foot view that allows us to think broadly about how policies affect sector level productivity. And policy could be agricultural policy, it could be environmental policy, it could be infrastructure investment. There's a broad range that could be, as they show, could be connected and affect agricultural productivity or these others spill over into these other sectors. And what's really important is that total factor productivity is often associated, or growth in total factor productivity is often associated with innovation. And what's relevant to this session in particular is that supply chains directly connect certain sectors together. And one result that stood out to me was that the growth in agricultural productivity and growth in truck transportation productivity both responded to shocks in the other, and also both responded in the same direction. So this could be positive if agricultural productivity grows and truck transportation productivity grows. But as we've seen this past year in 2020, there can also be negative shocks. And it makes sense to me that truck transportation and agricultural productivity would move together. So USDA released a report in December about the importance of highways to U.S. agriculture. And what they noted was that 56% of agricultural freight ton miles, so freight ton miles would be 1 ton moved 1 mile. So 1 ton could move 100 miles, that would be 100 freight ton miles, or 100 tons could move 1 mile, that would also be 100 freight ton miles. And so 56% of agricultural freight ton miles moved by truck in 2018, and over 80% of all agricultural freight tonnage moved on the highway system in 2018. And so what is clear is that these two sectors are directly connected. And using this particular case of trucking and agriculture, we can think about technology and innovations that might make either agriculture more efficient or trucking more efficient. But specifically, what I think is interesting is that intersection of the two. More generally, how does the interplay between trucking and agriculture and other downstream sectors affect productivity, either upstream or downstream? And if we're thinking about supply chains, then the events of this past year has really put supply chain resilience at the forefront of everyone's mind. And resilience, when we think about resilience, it's really how does the supply chain, the food supply chain, respond to a disruption? And a disruption could be an environmental disaster, it could be a facility shut down. There's a number of things that might qualify as a disruption, or it could be a shock in the case of a demand shock, like we saw for certain products this past year. And what we mean by resilience, so resilience is difficult to quantify, and there's not necessarily a well-defined way to think about it, at least at this point. But usually there's two ways that we think about resilience in food supply chains. The first way would be to ask, how quickly can we snap back to where we were previously after some sort of disruption or shock? And the second way to think about it is to ask, how quickly can we move on to a new steady state or a new normal after a disruption or shock? And so this past year, we've had various disruptions and shocks. And in the case of agriculture, I believe a lot of people are evaluating or shifting away from just-in-time inventory management. And I want to be clear that this has really been developing over the past decade. There's been a number of supply chain technologies and improvements to supply chain visibility but certainly this past year has provided an additional jumpstart to that. And so what I'm watching when it comes to the food supply chain is which types of firms or market participants might be able to benefit from these improved technologies. And a lot of that is going to have to do with the spillovers between the industries. So probably the most well-known example of innovation and the food supply chain is Walmart using blockchains to improve food traceability for food safety. And so obviously in that case, a retailer could benefit, consumers could benefit, farmers, transportation service providers, processors. So Sergio and Alejandro's paper, one thing I liked about it is that it suggested there was some synergies among these different types of market participants that could benefit from supply chain technologies and visibility. And ultimately, I think over time, we're going to see consumers demand more supply chain visibility just because they might have preferences over the production, processing, logistics, and transportation processes of the food they eat. So it's been a really exciting time, and I enjoyed sharing my thoughts with everyone. Thank you.
Heidi, thanks very much for your perspective. Next, I'm pleased to introduce our first panelist, Jim Pillin. Jim is founder and owner of Pillin Family Farms, a Nebraska-based family-owned farming operation. You can see some of the family behind him there, I believe, that provides expertise in all phases of production, producing quality pigs from breeding to finishing. The Pillin family acquired DNA Genetics in 2003. Pillin Family Farms and DNA Genetics is composed of more than 850 team members with 80 farms in Nebraska, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Canada. Jim, the platform is yours.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking time, and appreciate the chance to be able to share my perspective. I think that it's fair to say when most Americans think of technological advancement and productivity growth, we probably think more about the Silicon Valley than we maybe do about the heartland or the rural part of Nebraska. It's really unbelievable in my lifetime, the agricultural innovation and the resulting productivity growth that's taken place. Could not be more proud of all the people that make up agriculture and the work that's been done and accomplished. As Sergio noted, you just think about the gains in the 50 years post-World War II and the farm sector ranking number 5. And then if you think about what's taken place since renewable fuels policy, I think the growth's even been more substantial in the last 15 years. So it's a really, really significant thing for our economy and all that drives it. And I'm incredibly appreciative of everybody's work and exploring these issues to make innovation and efficiency better. Some of you might be aware I'm a candidate for governor of Nebraska, and I'm a believer that research about agricultural productivity is absolutely essential for the growth and the strengthening of agriculture. Here in Nebraska, 1 in 4 jobs relate to it. Everybody in Nebraska knows that if agriculture is successful, Nebraska is successful. It's really important. I know who I am. I'm a pig farmer and a veterinarian. I'm not an economist, so I'm over my skis on some of these issues. But you don't have to be as well educated as Sergio to understand the interconnectivity of agriculture to the greater good of our economy. The supply chain and all of the impacts, you know, we don't have to look back very long and just see what all took place in the last 18 months. And with you, I think spillovers is a good word, and then also constraints and that take place. So maybe I thought it might be of value to give a couple perspectives. I guess in my time, I'm old enough to be able to look back 50 years, and I thought I'd focus on maybe two things that could be real relevant in regard to spillovers and creating value for better value for all of our capital employed in agriculture. Maybe first, if we start thinking about crop farming, when I was a kid in the 70s, west of Highway 81 in Nebraska, where we didn't have irrigation and center pivot before center pivot technology, if we raised 60 bushel corn crop on the clay hills, that was a good year. Today, fence post to fence post with crop center pivot productivity, we're 4x that. So if we're not 240 to 300 bushel corn, you know, we don't stop off in the coffee shop to talk about it. So productivity gains in the last 50 years, 4x in crop farming. And so when you think about the spillover technology, and here's a question for everybody, because I'm not sure what that number is. I'm curious if anybody listening today has it, is what is the amount of on-farm grain storage capability today? I might guess that it could be more than 1 year's productivity. At any event, farmers figured out that if they own their own grain storage, and there's a multitude of factors in that they had a chance of being able to capture more value, sell grain when it works. On the pig side, we learned that if we can work hand in hand with our neighbors and buy their corn directly and not buy it through grain merchandising, we can control quality. And then you talk about a spillover that comes from it is the productivity gain and the efficiency that takes place. So that's maybe an interesting thought in terms of the incredible productivity on the corn side, and then because of farmers maintaining and quality control and not mixing sources, then the unbelievable improvement in the livestock industry. The other thing in terms of gains that I think will be helpful for everybody to grab a hold of the spillovers and the changes that have taken place. So when I was a kid in the 70s, we were really happy if we sold 15 pigs per sow per year, 15. Today, 50 years later, we're double that. But here's the number that's really fascinating, is that when we sold 15 pigs per sow per year, they were 200 pounds. So that was 3,000 pounds per sow per year. Today, we're in that 28 to 30 range and a little better, give or take, depending on different variables. But now we're selling them close to 300 pounds. So in the 50 years ago, we would be 3,000 pounds per sow sold to market. Today, we're 8 to 9,000, almost 300%, 3x. Really, really unbelievable. And then the other one I think that is really exciting, that everybody in the sustainability that's really proud is how much with genetic improvement and feeding technologies, how far a bushel of corn goes compared to 50 years ago. One number is consistent. We still use 10 bushel of corn to feed a pig to market. The difference is now we feed, 50 years ago, it was 200 pounds of live weight, and now it's 300. So we've improved the efficiency. By a significant amount. I think the other thing that I want to share about the future would simply be that being in the genetics business, we've got some extraordinarily brilliant people, and the genetics is nothing but a gigantic mathematical equation. And so today, we know where we're going. We're not hoping. We know where we're going. We have some tremendous technology in place where we know that every offspring of the Duroc ores that we make will continue to get to 300 pounds of body weight with 7 pounds less feed every year. 7 pounds less feed every year. So if back in the old days, we'd say in 10 years, that's almost a bag and a half of feed. So really an important number to remember and where we go. And then if you want to say, well, where will the productivity go? Well, the bottom line is we know that we will increase our total born 4/10. So we should be able to improve marketing by 4/10. So every 3 years, we should be over an extra pig. So let me finish with thinking about the constraints and the spillovers for the future of the policy. We're big believers, infrastructure roads. Roads are essential, as what was pointed out earlier. Broadband access is the other one, and I'll leave it with this thing to think about as the great country and state of Nebraska and the great country we live in. I'm a believer that the more value we can create from our corn and soybeans here at home, here in our country, and export value-added products, that helps stabilize return on capital in agriculture, keep it close to land. So I think it's important. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. Next, I'm pleased to welcome comments from Seth Post. Seth is the Regional General Manager at CGB Enterprises, one of the largest grain companies and exporters in the U.S. In his current role, Seth has direct oversight of trading, operations, strategic planning, budgeting, as well as employee development and safety training and compliance functions for the region, which consists of 30 elevators across 4 states. Welcome, Seth, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts with you all this morning. When I was first asked to be on this panel, I thought, directly how, productivity on farm has affected us here in the grain and handling and transportation industry. And I really think that I want to leave you with maybe 3 areas that, I really wanted to focus on as far as visiting with you today. First of all, it's no secret that we've seen massive consolidation and increased production on farms in the youth. And with that increased production, we've seen a real push to kind of piggyback onto what Jim said, to have the farmer have more direct control of their marketing. And this has led to a lot of producers throughout the Corn Belt and even into Oklahoma today, where I spend, a majority of my time managing the group, to build their own elevator storage on their own farm sites. And this has really changed our business dynamic on the grain handling side. We used to do a lot of business at our country elevator assets, and that volume of business has decreased substantially, really within the last 5 years to a decade. And, with that dynamic, it's really made our focus, or we've shifted our focus, I should say, more towards redeploying capital toward our terminal assets. So our shuttle facilities, our barge loading facilities, the assets that have a direct tie to the export supply chain is where we've really focused a lot of our effort. With the farmer having more control on the farm and having their own semi-fleets today, they've become extremely efficient at not only harvesting their crop, but storing and then transporting it to, one of our terminal markets. So, consolidation's not going away. I think that we're going to continue to see that in the farming space and in the grain space. And, I think that that's where our continued focus will be. The second part I wanted to kind of talk about was how it's affected us from the pandemic standpoint. we, relative to some of the, other industries that experienced, significant supply shocks, like the grocer and some other, folks in the ag business, we didn't have that same experience. We really, everybody's pretty familiar, I think, with the run up in commodity prices lately. We've really been business as usual. We have had a very robust export market, and we had several things that we had to sidestep as it pertains to deep cleaning of businesses and things of that nature. But how we actually get product to market and getting that product into an export channel really was business as usual for us. So we were, I think, somewhat unique in that we didn't have a lot of the disruption that some of the other sectors had. Now, it did push us more or accelerate us more to looking at e-business, so e-contracting, things of that nature with the producer, so that we don't have as much contact with the customer that way. Automation, that's one thing that was mentioned in the letter. For this symposium, we've focused a lot on trying to automate scale systems and areas where we can really keep truck flows moving and things of that nature. And we're going to continue to deploy capital, toward automation, especially, with the labor situation that everybody's dealing with right now. We're going to need to continue to, assess those areas and ensure that, we're automating where we can and eliminating non-skilled labor where we can. The last piece that I really wanted to leave, this dovetails onto what Jim said as well. As the farmer continues to be more and more efficient and, the focus on our infrastructure, our transportation infrastructure within the United States is going to be vitally important. In order for us to stay competitive on a global scale, we absolutely have to address some of the issues within our lock systems and on the internal waterways and our rail transportation. So those are all areas that, I hope have a lot of focus, as we go forward here, because the producer, as he continues to be more efficient, we're just going to have upgraded roads, upgraded rail, upgraded lock systems, things of that nature. So we've definitely seen an interest in the Gulf in wanting to add capacity. So there are several companies out there today that want to continue to bet on the fact that the export market is going to stay robust and that, we've got to continue to figure out a way to feed the world. In order to get to that capacity, it's going to be vitally important, that we're focusing on that infrastructure. Those were really the three areas that I wanted to touch on today. I really don't have anything else to add.
Well, thanks very much, Seth. That leaves us more time for questions, I guess. Our presenters have covered a lot of ground in this session, but I'm sure there are some questions that have not been addressed. I've been seeing some come in here. So we now want to turn to all of them with some questions. And if you have a question, remember, please submit it using the link on the player page. So I think I'll start with, there was a question yesterday in our session about a polling question. What's the biggest risk to productivity growth in the future? I'd be curious what each of you think about that, how you'd respond to that question, what might be some implications of the risks to productivity growth in the future. Anybody want to take that? Smooth sailing? No risks?
I can give it a try. I think that today everybody in agriculture is under stress with not having enough people to execute everything to take advantage of all the opportunities. So I can speak specifically to our business, and I guess we have the favorite saying is that the good news is the pigs need us, and the bad news is the pigs need us 7 days a week and on Christmas morning. And so a great challenge is maximizing the biological potential of livestock. The potential to maximize efficiency is absolutely incredible, and we really get jacked up about what we can do because of our excellence in genetic progress genetically. The challenge, there's a great challenge to because of the people challenges, and all of us are trying to figure out how to implement more technology. But it takes great people, and that's a great challenge to maximizing the productivity potential that we all want to get after.
Thanks, Jim. I got a question in here for Seth. Global grain stockpiling was prevalent during the pandemic. Do you foresee a continuation of this trend in the grain export market as the world moves into the post-pandemic era?
I feel that we're, probably going to continue to see at least a fairly robust cycle here on the export side for the next couple of years. With the situation the way that it is, if we have hiccups anywhere in production, anywhere in the world, it's really going to continue to put pressure on a market that's already, relative to what the farmer can get paid today, pretty high in value. So, yes, they are stockpiling grain. Yes, I do think that that's going to continue, which, downstream should lead to continued high prices here. But I would think that a cycle like this is going to take at least a couple years maybe to kind of work itself out.
Very good. Got a question in here, I think could be for any of you. If firms are moving away from just-in-time supply chain management, can you explain or give some examples of what these supply chains are transitioning to, or what they'll look like in the future? Well, Heidi, you talked about that, but anybody could take that one.
Sure. So what I believe is happening is that, first of all, firms are holding more inventory. So instead of having, 1 week's worth of inventory, they might hold 1 month. So you could call it just in case supply chains. The other difference is that there's more communication among firms along the supply chain. And the pandemic has really resulted in a big push for that in particular.
All right. We got another question in about automation and technology. What specific type of automation or technology enhancements do you see most impactful in the next 5 years? Anybody want to give their view on which specific kinds of automation and technology might have the biggest impact?
Maybe I can speak to technological advancements. Obviously, the highest cost in terms of the livestock sectors is feed cost, and so been lots of implementation in the last 10 to 15 years, and there will continue to be more in terms of feed manufacturing and to continue to decrease feed conversion so that a bushel of corn will go further. Renewable fuels policy, the byproducts have been a big deal in terms of feeding cattle in Nebraska, getting through really cold spells, keeping intake up. So I think that's one. And then also the technology in terms of measurements and accurate delivery systems. Now today, because of the technology, we don't have to estimate how much is there. Ordering system is all streamlined. It's unbelievable what those kinds of technologies have really helped. And then lastly, I would say that the more sensors that will help us create the perfect environment for the pig 24 hours a day is really a big deal.
Thanks, Jim. We're getting some more in here. Oh, go ahead, Heidi.
Oh, I wanted to piggyback off this. I completely agree with Jim. I think, animal scientists and crop scientists are going to continue doing a great job at making agriculture more efficient. I also think that what's going to be really important, specifically for the perishable agricultural products, is advancements in the logistics sector.
Okay. We've got a question in here about something that Heidi mentioned, but the question is for Seth. It's that supply chain visibility is becoming more prevalent. The example of Walmart. How do you think you will handle the traceability of grain as farmers are asked to document how they grow their crops? Any comments on that?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I don't really know what the future holds for traceability, but what I can say is, having been to Japan and some other countries, I don't know that we'll ever get to the point, and we may, where there's, a menu that sits outside that literally tells you, the farmer that grew the cattle or, produced, whatever it is that you're going to be sitting down to eat that night. But I will say that there is an absolute desire amongst the consumer to want to have more traceability. And I do think that, yes, we will see a continued push that direction. I just don't know how, I just don't know where we end up, I guess.
Very good. I've got a real short question here for Jim. What's the future of independent hog operations?
It's a great question. I've had this belief my entire life, and it's never wavered in the pig business. If you have to love it, you have to have a great passion for it. So any size producer that has a passion and a love for being in the pig business can compete with anybody in the world. So what I get jacked up about is all of us in agriculture in this great country. We can compete with anybody in the world. So if you have a passion and grind through it 7 days a week, there's a great future for your family.
Maybe staying with that too. I mean, there's questions about consolidation. What about in any of your segments you want to speak to, or segments that you know about in terms of whether consolidation will accelerate, become less intense, less concentrated? Anybody want to take that?
Well, I definitely know as far as it pertains to the grain handling side, we're going to continue to see more consolidation. I mean, there's been massive consolidation in just the last decade. And even with our company, we're owned by two Japanese shareholders, Itochu International and Zeno Grain Corp. And we're not finished with the purchase yet, but we're in the process. And there's a news release out about this about a year ago of acquiring most of Bunge's inland origination assets. So, as we continue to see the bigger companies consolidate, I do think that there's going to be, now I think it's going to be different consolidation for different people. Origination is a big piece of our business, and that's why we wanted to continue to look at infrastructure that supports that. But I think it'll be more strategic in nature. You're seeing a lot of the big grain companies right now really want to be in the processing space, soybean processing, corn processing, things of that nature. And so again, I think there'll be some companies that focus more strategically on what they're good at. But yes, there will continue to be more consolidation.
I can't bite my lips on this one. This is one I have a tremendous amount of passion and belief in it. I think it's really, really essential that family farmers stay successful for our rural communities so that they can continue to grow and be vibrant. I think it's really, really important that families work harder than ever for multi-generational planning, and that if we will, we give up a little bit of our, quote, independence as farmers, and that we collaborate and work together so we can compete with anybody as we grow more livestock, as we create more protein and create more value. I'm a believer we've been given too much of the topsoil away. We need to work together to be successful, to go against this constant consolidation. I think it's essential for rural communities coast to coast.
All right, I've got a question here for Sergio. With advances in AI, autonomous vehicles, blockchain, do you foresee productivity in non-ag sectors of the economy having greater spillover in the future to agriculture?
Well, thank you for the question. I think they will definitely. Whether they will show up in a study like the one that Alejandro and I did is an open question, because our study is probably too high an altitude. It's too much of an overview to detect such a fine type of spillovers. Consider that in our case, we aggregate all agriculture. I mean, not just corn, soybean, but also hogs, all kinds of livestock, and not just for a particular state, but for across all of the U.S. So the type of spillover from specific technology would be very difficult to detect in the type of study that we did.
Okay, I have a question here, probably for Seth, but others might have thoughts too. Do you expect farmers to continue to add to on-farm storage relative to elevator storage, and what are the implications?
Absolutely. And, what I spoke to there relative to, putting up storage and having to kind of reshift our focus as it pertains to our country elevator assets. We're just going to have to get a lot better at redeploying capital towards our terminal assets and those assets that they desire to utilize that have a direct, line to the export pipeline. So I believe that they're going to keep putting them up. They can build space a lot cheaper than the commercial elevator can, and it does give them more control. And, I always think, honestly, and I try to convince producers when they bring it up that they should be putting up space if they can afford it. It does give them opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have. So I don't see that going away. And as farms get bigger, I just think they're going to want more and more of that control on site.
Okay, we got a question here. Yesterday we talked about research and innovations, and one of those could be alternative forms of meat. We got a question specifically about that. Does anyone have any thoughts on how those developments may affect traditional forms of agriculture and investments in ag?
I can give it a try. We've spent a lot of energy working with people in these conversations. And I think maybe I'll just keep it really brief. That is extraordinarily misleading. That if anybody's getting really, I'm astonished at the amount of capital being poured into that industry, because if the consumer, my belief is if the consumer doesn't get duped and looks at all of the chemicals that's in those ingredients, they will come to the conclusion, and the facts are really crystal clear, that livestock production is what will feeds the world and quote, save the planet, because we have to have livestock. It's been that way since Noah's Ark, to save the planet for generations and generations to come, and the most efficient conversion of calories. So I think all of us in agriculture have to do a better job of telling that story and getting the science and the facts out, because there's there's a far side that's saying things that are not backed up by science, and it's the attractive thing to talk about, but will not be good for the consumer.
Thanks, Jim. All right, I have a fairly long question here, but I think it's a good one for our conference and for our region. So productivity here in the heartland is impacted from supply chain limitations, ports, roads, infrastructure, and labor, et cetera. What specific support areas can be created here in the U.S. that's upstream from these problems seen from COVID that directly support future productivity of ag businesses, family farms, and helping Main Street?
I definitely agreed with Seth when he was talking about the importance of infrastructure, and a big one, it depends on the agricultural product, is the Mississippi River and the need to dredge that. And so I certainly think that having, for example, the Mississippi River and having very efficient transportation systems is important for agricultural exports in particular.
Thanks, Heidi. I have another question for Sergio. Sergio showed the linkages between ag and non-ag productivity. Do we know how these measures look like for different regions of the United States?
I wish we could know. So one problem we had when we attempted this first was with data. Essentially, this data is at the aggregate regional level, and also we tried to see whether we could learn something by looking at data from, say, Europe. And unfortunately, this is the longest data set that we could find with any reasonable quality to answer this type of question. Like, for example, for Europe, the time series were much shorter and even more questionable, the quality. So I wish we could have it. If anybody has it, we would love to have that data.
All right, kind of sticking with some of these questions have been about impact of the pandemic, with the meatpacking plant closures and increases in food prices. Curious if anybody has any thoughts about national security issues with domestic food production versus foreign ownership of ag infrastructure, and how that might impact investment or productivity heading forward, production or storage or.
Well, I guess since we lived the effect of it a year ago, and everybody in agriculture dealing with livestock had to think through unspeakable challenges and come to conclusions to keep your business viable. I think that if we don't look back and learn from the extraordinary constraints of the system and try to come away with some policy that will help that from not taking place, I think we're really gonna miss the boat. I think there's I don't in the end that hourglass really caused a problem, and fortunately, it came to a conclusion in time before all of our grocery stores' shelves weren't empty. I think we've got to learn from it, and we've got to understand what the shortcomings are. I think everybody's understanding that all of our businesses are interconnected, and all of our businesses are about the people, and we have to do a better job so that everybody can come to work every day and have 100% confidence that they can do it safely. We've got to get better at communication, and we have to be better so that those kinds of problems don't arise again next time.
Okay, maybe one last question about future investment. What types of investments do you expect we'll see in the next 5 years as we discuss future prospects gains in productivity from your respective areas of expertise or business or industry?
Well, I mentioned it a little bit towards the end of when I finished up there, and I think at least from where we sit, we've already seen a desire to want to add capacity in the Gulf. I think that folks are betting long term that we're looking already at maybe a 40 to 50% increase just in some projects that have been announced. So, I think that, again, to what Heidi said, and I've said it, and I think Jim touched on it too, our focus on transportation and our infrastructure going forward in order to keep up with the efficiency of the American farmer is going to be vitally important for us to stay competitive.
Maybe as the last question, do others want to offer a suggestion of what kind of investments are we most likely to expect the next 5 years that could have the biggest impact on agricultural productivity?
I mean, one investment that I think people across the supply chain are making is really taking advantage of the data and remote sensing technologies and actually how to use that data. That data exists, but I think that we haven't quite really capitalized off of it yet. And I think smart people will figure that out.
I agree, maybe. I tried to think how best to put it, but that's exactly what I think too. I think there are ways of analyzing data and collecting data are the way forward.
Well, thanks very much. I'm glad we had a little extra time for questions. Questions are always fun. We got some good ones from the audience today for each of you.